Ah, the ancient Greeks. Our legacy is so dependent and so intertwined with that of the ancient Greeks. It's important for us to understand how the ancient Greeks built their civilization and what text their civilization was built on. First, we need to look at what is Greek mythology. So Greek mythology is the body of myths and teachings that belong to the ancient Greeks, concerning their gods and heroes, the nature of their world, and the origins and significance of their own cult and ritual practices. It was part of the religion in ancient Greece. Modern scholars refer to the study of myths in an attempt to shed light on the religious and political institutions of ancient Greece and its civilization to gain understanding of the nature of myth-making itself. This is one of the most complete and extensive mythologies that we have, the Greek mythology. And it is so important that the Romans, when they conquer the Greeks, they're already exposed to the mythology, so they just incorporate their own gods into the Greek pantheon. Our democracy is born out of the Greek legacy. Nationalism is born out of the Greek mythology. This is one of the most important mythologies that we have, and it's the most studied one in high school. You're more familiar with Greek and Roman mythology than any of the other mythologies we've been studying. But it's important to understand that Greek mythology, just like Christian origins, are exactly the same. These texts were looked at just like the Bible. Hesiod and Homer are writing at the very beginning of Greek history. The two have very different styles. Homer has a very narrative style, while Hesiod is doing something completely different. His style incorporates lists and alliteration and puns to kind of forward his story, but it's not as narrative as we generally like to read. Hesiod's doing something else, though. He's setting up the pantheon of Greek city-states, because during this early period of ancient Greece, all of the city-states, the small city-states and tribal areas around Greece, were governed by their own law and had their own sets of myths and religions. What Hesiod does is he goes and he takes all little bits and pieces from all of these surrounding city-states and incorporates them into one major myth. And what this does is this creates a pantheon for all of these city-states to really grow and flourish under. It creates a set of gods for all of these people, rather than all of these little areas having different gods. And around 600 to 400 BCE, we see the rise of this literature and the expansion of the gods from Hesiod's story. We also see the rise of philosophers and the great masterpieces, because this is the high point of ancient Greece. Something else to notice during this high point is that there are several battles raging, and out of these battles, we see great works of art and great works of literature and great thinkers discussing the issues that come about with war and poverty and problems. So this is why we see the rise of ancient philosophers. They're trying to create a civilization that can withstand things like war and natural disaster. And by having a strong mythology and a strong belief system, we can create these great civilizations. I really like this timeline because it shows really everything that's going on during this period. Who's being toppled, what civilization's being toppled, what buildings are being built, what's happening in this ancient culture during this time. And it spans a really large amount of time. This helps us as readers kind of gain our bearings when we're looking at stories like these. So the originating stories and gods are coming from Hesiod and Homer. But all of these other authors like Aesop, Sappho, Pindar, Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, and Aristophanes, and many others, are really just forwarding the story. They're expanding upon these ideas that were set in place by Hesiod and Homer. And this creates a really binding agent for all of these little cultural tribes around ancient Greece, and allows them to flourish as a civilization. So I really want to talk about Hesiod a little bit now. As you read the Theogony, you should be aware that its author, Hesiod, shows a clear bias for the eventual winner of the father-son struggle, the male sky god Zeus, and the bias for the male against the female. And he sets this in place at the very beginning of his story. In other words, it's probable that Hesiod slants or distorts parts of some of his stories in order to make Zeus and the male powers of brute force look good, and to make some of the female powers focused around the natural cycle of birth and death look bad. And you may wonder how he does this. But if you think about motherhood and you think about childbirth and the father immediately eating the children because he's paranoid that he's going to be overthrown by one of his children, so why not just eat them? You might understand the division that's being set up here. So we're setting in place a division between a mother and father over the children. This division between the mother and father is carried on for generations and generations. As we know, Greek gods are very patriarchal. They take what they want with no regard to the female for the most part. And this creates a problem in the mythology. It creates a patriarchal nature that we don't break, really. We still follow rules that are really patriarchal. We still believe in texts that are very patriarchal and have these same elements in them. So it's something to consider. And Hesiod was a very patriarchal writer, and it's not as evident in Theogony as it is in his next called Works and Days, which is kind of a farmer's almanac. He writes it to his brother about how to take care of the farm, but he is very, very patriarchal in Works and Days. Not as bad in Theogony, but in Works and Days we get the story of Pandora, which villainizes all females again. So it's very important to kind of look at what Hesiod is doing with his words. So who was this guy, Hesiod? He was a Greek poet generally thought by scholars to have been active between 750 and 650 BCE, around the same time as Homer. He is generally regarded as the first written poet in the Western tradition to regard himself as an individual persona with an active role to play in his subject. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that Hesiod was really the first poet who inserted himself into his own poetry, kind of like a narrator. He makes his own assumptions about what is going on with these gods in some of his works. And this is really the first time we see the poet have an active voice in his story. So this becomes kind of important. Ancient authors credited Hesiod and Homer with establishing the Greek religious customs, but modern scholars refer to him as a major source of Greek mythology, farming techniques, animal husbandry, early economic thought. He's sometimes considered history's first economist, archaic Greek astronomy, and ancient timekeeping. This guy was really a Renaissance man, so it's easy to see why his work is so great, and why it would have been enough to kind of bring these little city-states together under one massive umbrella of leadership. Hesiod's point of view is a little different too, but if the Theogony is about anything, it is about birth, the birth of the gods, which is what the title means. In this early creation time, the gods are synonymous with the universe and the order of the universe. Yet throughout the Theogony, the gods behave in a most disorderly fashion. Why do we think this is? There are many interesting answers to this question, but here's a start that I really want you to think about. The poem presents the creation of the gods and the universe and the consolidation of God's power as a struggle between fathers and sons, and between the male force and the female birth. Okay, so when you read Theogony, you see one god being overturned by his son, another god being overturned by his son, and this paranoia that seeps in because of the way that Hesiod writes this paranoia. He writes this into the mythology. Always be wary of those who come after you because they want what you have. And then again, like I mentioned earlier, this division between the male force and the female birth. In one instance, we see either, I think it's Cronus who shoves um, the babies back into the mother. And again, we see this brutalization of women um, because of the paranoia set in place because of the father-son struggle. And of course, this sets in place division, cosmic division, and cosmic division becomes very important in how we create things. And we'll talk more about this later in this PowerPoint. I do want to discuss a little bit about Hesiod's works and days because we get some rather important bits of the story from this tale as well. But we don't have time to cover both of these events, and we really, when we're talking about creation, need to look at that first pantheon creating tale. But I'm going to give you a short little rundown of Works and Days, which is a didactic poem of about 800 lines written around 700 BCE. At its center, the Works and Days is a sort of farmer's almanac in which Hesiod instructs his brother Perseus in the agricultural arts. Scholars have seen this work against the background of an agrarian crisis in the mainland Greece. This agrarian crisis means that farmers weren't producing enough food to sustain civilization, the civilization as it was. So this inspired a wave of colonial expeditions in search of new land, and this new land, of course, expands the power and expands the land which Greece has. Um, but in the poem, Hesiod also offers his brother extensive moralizing advice on how he should live his life, and this is where most of the misogynistic, patriarchal ideas on women come in. The Works of Days is perhaps the best known for its two mythological etiologies, cause and reaction, for the toil and pain that define the human condition. The story of Prometheus and Pandora, the so-called myth of the 5 ages, also come from this. This idea of cause and reaction, we see the rise of disdain amongst workers in these early Greek civilizations. And so, of course, we want to explore these ideas. So we look at toil, and why do we toil? And why do we put ourselves through the pain of work and, at this time, hard labor, farming, agrarian lifestyle? How do we manage that? I mean, how do we keep ourselves going when our life is so bleak? Well, these myths help us do that. We're pleasing the gods in some way. And that's important to remember. The Promethean story is probably one of the most important stories we get from Hesiod. Hesiod introduces Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus in the Theogony, and he kind of expands on their tale in Works and Days. Prometheus is a trickster god, and for those of you who don't know, a trickster god kind of walks the line between good and bad. If you're familiar with Norse mythology, Loki is a trickster god. Sometimes they do nice things, sometimes they do bad things. But Prometheus and Epimetheus are also tasked with creating humans in Greek mythology. Prometheus carefully crafts humans. Epimetheus, not so much. His humans aren't quite as perfect, and later myths tell funny stories about Epimetheus gluing parts on humans upside down and other funny kind of humorous tales about Epimetheus and his lack of knowledge. While Prometheus is creating something skillful, Epimetheus doesn't really know what's going on. But Prometheus has a soft spot for humankind because they are his creation. As we see, many gods in many pantheons have this same soft spot. The creator god of the humans is always kind of a protector of sorts in mythology. But there was one scene that really kind of upends the relationship between Zeus and Prometheus, because Prometheus did fight with Zeus during the Titanomachy against his siblings because he knew the outcome of the battle. And he becomes kind of a stabilized figure amongst the gods. But the gods were having a celebration at Mycone, and Prometheus was tasked with the sacrificial share, or separating the sacrificial share. And Prometheus, being the trickster that he is, decides to harvest the meats and the good stuff for the humans and set aside and trick the Greek gods by wrapping the bones in the glistening fat, which was a prized part of the animal during this time, as you can imagine, because oil burns and keeps fires going for long periods of time. It also keeps you warm, so on and so forth. So of course he separates the good parts and wraps them in the skins and the stomach and things like those to make them look unappealing. And then he takes the bones with no meat on them and wraps them in the fat, making them look very appealing. He presents them to the gods, and of course Zeus picks the fat-covered bones, while the humans are blessed with the meat and the innards. But this angers Zeus, and Zeus takes fire from man. Well, Prometheus feels that this punishment is unjust. So at another celebration, Prometheus steals fire, hiding a coal in a fennel stalk, which is kind of like a bamboo stalk, so it's hollow in the middle. He scoops up a coal and takes it down to humans on Earth, where they will forever have fire. And of course, this angers Zeus, and Zeus punishes Prometheus by chaining him to a rock and allowing a giant bird to come and eat his liver daily, and overnight the liver regenerates, and the bird comes again to eat his liver day after day eternally, causing Prometheus to be this suffering, to be depicted as a suffering god who was punished by Zeus. This is the Hesiodic tradition. Now, around 500 to 400 BCE, we see the rise of Aeschylus. And Aeschylus is this great tragedian, and he writes a trilogy of plays for a competition on Prometheus. Prometheus Pythagoras, Prometheus Bound, and Prometheus Unbound, or Prometheus the Firebringer, Prometheus Bound, and Prometheus Unbound. We only have Prometheus Bound. That is the only complete play that we have left from Aeschylus. The others we have fragments of, they're mentioned by other authors, but we do not know about these other two plays or Aeschylus's overall vision for Prometheus. But we do know that other writers gravitate towards what Aeschylus set in place. Because what Aeschylus does is he provides a vehicle for Prometheus to not be a cautionary tale, but to somehow become a champion of man through the gifts that are provided with fire. So if man has fire, man can see. He can see at night, meaning that he can do things at night, whereas before he couldn't do things. It provides heat for cooking and preserving foods. It provides heat for melting metals. It provides heat for making medicines and heat for warming homes. Fire really gives man everything that he needs to flourish and transform civilization into an industrialized nation. And so therefore Aeschylus really paints Prometheus in a different light than Hesiod, not as this cautionary tale of what not to do, but as a person who went against the oppressive gods for a cause, for the cause of man. He was a champion of man. This in turn leads Prometheus to be this kind of I guess, Christ-like figure in ancient Greek mythology. And as Christianity rises, they try to stomp out um, the myth of Prometheus altogether because it is so Christ-like. We see a God suffering for humans because he wants to see them succeed. And this Promethean tale becomes something that authors gravitate towards still today. Um, Percy Shelley champions this in the 1800s. Gandhi uses Percy Shelley's writings when he is marching. Prometheus becomes this figure of defeating oppression and tyranny in the world. So that's why his tale is so important, and I didn't want us to get away from talking about Prometheus because he's not a prevalent figure in theogony, but he is a prevalent figure in Works and Days, as well as Pandora, the woman in the middle here. We get Pandora's story through this whole Promethean tale because Zeus is angry at Prometheus and knows that Epimetheus isn't the brightest. So in order to get back at humans, he sends Epimetheus a jar and tells him not to open it. Well, of course, Pandora, Epimetheus's wife, is so curious that she cannot keep herself from opening the jar. And it's not a box in the myth, it's a jar. So Pandora, while Epimetheus is away, opens the jar, and all of the trouble of humanity is leashed onto society. All of the woes of humanity, disease, famine, war, all of these things are leashed onto society when Pandora opens the jar. But she realizes what she's done immediately and shuts the jar and traps something in the jar. And what she traps in the jar is hope. And hope is what's left for mankind. What is left for mankind to combat all of these horrible things that have been loosed from the jar itself. And this hope is really what's provided in mythology. This hope to keep us going even when times are hard, because Prometheus, look what Prometheus did for us. If he's willing to do this for us, why can't we be willing to have enough hope to get us through life? So this becomes a really important part of Greek mythology that is altered and evolves as time goes on. Hesiod also provides a very close look at cosmic order. And the cosmic order comes from chaos, which is Greek for the abyss or gap. After this abyss, three more first powers come into being. This is how we create this pantheon. We see Gaia, who is the earth, Tartarus, the dark area under the earth, which is kind of like hell, and Eris, desire. The source for our English word is erotic. At first, Gaia, the earth, does not need males to help her give birth to the rest of her domain, namely the mountains, the sea, and the sky. She talks about this in line 131 when she talks about creating without any joy of desirable love. It is only after she mates with Uranus, the sky, that strife, called Eris, and division enter the world. And this cosmic division is highlighted by Hesiod. And division, of course, is what usually happens in creation stories. From a start with an undifferentiated lump or gap, like the abyss or chaos, the universe begins to divide into more and more beings of increasing variety, diversity, and complexity, much like a cell divides. Thus, as Carrie Carigny points out, The order of the universe was established by these unions and separations, the divine marriages and births, constituting a mythical history of the primordial beings, which taken as a whole we call theogony. As you read, notice the various kinds of unions and separations and births which take place. At the beginning, the important group of gods is the 12 Titans, plus the Cyclops and the 100-handers, the early powers born of Gaia and Uranus. But that quickly changes and develops into this giant pantheon of Greek gods, which gives every writer after that the ability to create stories based on the gods that Hesiod has brought together under one umbrella of the ancient Greek mythology. And this stabilizes all of these unstable city-states by creating a mythology that encompasses all of them. We all have one religion now. So we're all on the same team, and this team needs to fight against this other team. And this is how expansion happens for the Greeks, and later the Romans, and every other civilized nation that comes after it. Now, I'd like for you to look a little bit closer at the poetics of what Hesiod is doing. So the video that you're about to watch is a brief lecture by Peter Struck, who is a professor of classical Greek and Roman mythology at the University of Pennsylvania. So please follow up this lecture with the video by Peter Struck. Thank you.